Welcome to Impressions and Chai. I'm Max, and today I'm joined by Akaash, who's the CEO and co-founder of AdSkate. In this episode, we're talking about why pre-campaign analysis is becoming essential, not just for performance, but for privacy, creative clarity, and growth. Can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us what AdSkate does?
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-founders at AdSkate, and I have had the fortune and the opportunity to start a company up with Shreyas, who's been my ally and also a fellow co-founder at AdSkate. So both of us have come into this realm of entrepreneurship through different streams. So in a different life and form, I used to work at an ad agency up in Michigan, which did all the advertising for a automotive company. And then following my experience there, I decided to jump into the realm of entrepreneurship with Shreyas. So that's a quick background about me, and would love to get into the set of questions and ideas that you may have and that might unfurl today.
Absolutely. So what led AdSkate to build pre-campaign analysis? Was there a specific gap we're seeing in the ad industry?
Great question. So, one of the major reasons why we jumped into the realm of building pre-campaign analysis was that by talking to different folks, be it in sales calls, also customer discovery calls, as well as actual customers, we realized that they like the analytics portion, but they have a huge gaping hole where before even the campaign launches, they have the creative in hand, but they don't know whether one, they're talking to the right audience, or two, even whether they are essentially resonating with the right personas. So that becomes a massive point of conundrum. And that's essentially what led to us building the pre-campaign analysis solution.
That's really interesting. So if you were to define it, what exactly is pre-campaign analysis and why has it become so big? Why is it something for people to consider?
Pre-campaign analysis in a one-liner is a method and a way where you can study your audiences without having to spend media dollars. That's essentially like how I would structure or how I would put it in a one-liner. The one major thing about pre-campaign analysis that I would like to emphasize on is that it essentially enables the end user to understand the predictive creative quality and audience interests. So given the fact that like ad costs are rising, and given the fact that campaigns essentially have a huge telltale sign, this lands up becoming a mode and a medium to understand whether there's resonation with the audience set, and whether there's a possibility of building the right set of creatives for the future.
Interesting. So what makes this different then from traditional A/B testing or using past reports?
So A/B testing jumps into the realm of what most platforms do today. They essentially compare, like the word says, it compares an A and a B, and then it provides you answers to it. In a in the way in which we do it, or the logic that we have applied to our pre-campaign analysis, is that we have essentially studied a lot of different audience segments by studying open source articles, by also studying the Pew Research open source reports that they have. And by studying these different reports and open source articles, we built our own models. And what we do is that we are essentially able to take the audience set and the creative, and then land up telling the end advertiser or brand whether that specific creative or a set of creatives actually do well with a specific audience set. So, for example, if let's say Nike today comes to AdSkate with a book of 5 creatives, and they want to test it and understand how it's doing from a pre-campaign analysis standpoint of view, be able to tell them like how that specific set of 5 creatives is doing with, let's say, the Gen Z population, or how it's doing with, let's say, people who are interested in athletics, or people who are interested in soccer, so on and so forth. So for each audience set, we've actually gone ahead and done a deep dive of studying different research papers and then building out the models accordingly.
So with all of that, how have privacy changes impacted this specific section of advertising?
So privacy is an interesting point and a point of conversation, Max. So privacy essentially leads to, initially people land up thinking about GDPR, CCPA, cookie tracking, the different changes that Apple and Google themselves brought into the ecosystem. It also leads to the point of point of understanding whether there's transparency and whether there's any data storage. So the great part about our pre-campaign analysis solution is that we essentially do not store any form of cookies, nor do we essentially study any type of iOS tracking data. Whatever data sets that we study is based on the models that we have built in. And unlike like a black box environment that exists in other different platforms, we essentially have been able to build our model sets based on, like I mentioned earlier, like open research papers that exist in the ecosystem. So we're pretty transparent with what we have built, and it can be applied in any different market, be it the US, be it Europe, be it Asia, and be it even the Middle East market too.
Wow. So privacy laws in advertising seem to be changing all the time. They're complicated. So why is this pre-campaign planning more important and more valuable as these laws keep shifting?
In most cases, if you look at it, privacy laws come into being only in a retroactive manner. It doesn't come into place in a proactive manner. It's only after the damage is done that people go into damage control method or into a methodology of damage control. So that being said, the pre-campaign analysis portion that we have built becomes huge in a privacy first world because it's not taking anyone's first party data, nor is it stealing someone's data set and then studying it for an external purpose and using it in that fashion. So in that regard, it becomes really useful. And as laws and people start abiding by specific new nomenclatures, the pre-campaign analysis tool lands up being a massive aid for brands and advertisers. They don't need to stress about another additional factor that can impede their campaign's growth as well as impede their campaign's process too.
So this all ties into creatives. Why is creative so important then within the context of privacy laws and ad performance today?
So creatives today, as you like hinted, right? Like one of the major things that's important in the performance of a creative today is it's always important to keep into consideration the audience that you're targeting, whether there's cultural resonance, whether there is any sort of focus on attention, and attention is a massive conversation too. So how do you grab attention also becomes a key point. Different ethnicities have different attention types, same case with different demographics too. So keeping those ideologies in place, we feel that creative pre-testing or even creative testing lands up becoming the essential part in terms of a campaign as well as in terms of a campaign performance too.
That makes sense. At AdSkate, there's been a lot of creatives analyzed. Has there been any common trends or insights that you've learned from analyzing all these different creatives?
Yeah, in fact, let's say if you take an example of the type of campaigns we have ran, right? We have ran a lot of B2C campaigns, and we have realized that in a B2C sector, especially a lot of campaigns are run on social platforms, be it Instagram, be it TikTok, be it other social platforms too. There is an increasing need or there's an increasing use of short form videos. So the engagement with short form videos is where essentially we have noticed that there's a huge spike in trend. In addition to that, like one other thing that if I had to break it down in terms of an audience set, that's essentially that we have studied is the Gen Z generation. So the Gen Z generation we have learned is that compared to the millennial generation that I belong to, they prefer authenticity and then they prefer like absolute clarity in the messaging as well as even in the positioning of the product in itself. The other two ecosystems that I mentioned, which is the millennial and boomers, they like other aspects of a visual, which would be like what the pricing is, whereas the Gen Z population likes the inclusivity that a product might bring in. So cultural nuances and cultural cues essentially land up being really, really important for the performance of a product as well as for the performance of an ad campaign too.
I'm sure being on the ground, there's a lot of really interesting data that comes up. Are there any trends that you're seeing that, or you're noticing that you think marketers need to be aware of?
So the rising trend that we see right now, and I think we highlighted this earlier in the conversation, is that people are constantly wary of their privacy, and it deep dives into whether their privacy data is being used in a malicious manner, as well as whether it's being used as well as whether it's used for AI training. So the one thing that I would like state to a marketer who's listening to this is that there's a huge aspect of keeping AI in use, but also knowing how to use AI too. And brands are being strategic about it. Brands are learning how to implement this in terms of improving their workflow.
So then over the next few years, where would you expect pre-campaign analysis to be headed?
I would say it's going to land up being implemented by every brand, be it big or small, or by every ad agency, be it big or small again, because every brand and every ad agency is going through the cycle of studying their audience set, producing out information or ad copies that could resonate with that specific persona or ecosystem, and then they're trying really hard to jive with them. That's why the pre-campaign analysis becomes a no-brainer for them. It becomes a pure plug and play for how they operate and how they could be implemented.
Is there any advice that you give to these and some upcoming agencies or brands that want to understand the way that their creatives and campaigns are going to interact with an audience and how they can make sure that it hits the right note?
I think one of the major things that I would like to tell every brand and every ad agency is that like AI is not here to replace any of the functions that they do. Essentially, it's supposed to be an aid, and it is an aid for the way in which they work and the way in which they perform work too. And in addition to that, I would also say that, especially deep diving into pre campaign testing, it becomes also a mode and a methodology of quick learning and a quick iteration rather than having to spend time and mind cycles understanding whether potentially an ad works well with an audience set or not.
Got it. Are there any creative blind spots that people tend to miss?
Yes, two major things. I think that's a really pointed question. One major blind spot is cultural cues, and the second blind spot that marketers also miss is essentially listening to the audience set too. Because what might work in one, let's say, what might work in one country might not work in another. So, for example, what might work in New York City might not work in Miami or might not work even in Pittsburgh, where we are today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So those are my main questions. Thanks so much for answering. I learned a lot. Where can people learn more about AdSkate and maybe try it out for themselves?
I think they can hear about us on our website, adskate.com. They can hear about us on our socials. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out. If they want to reach out about any sort of information that we spoke about today or get a sense of what we're working towards, we're all available through all mediums. So hit us up.
That's it for today's episode of Impressions in Chai. A big thank you to Akaash for sharing his insights. If you want to learn more about AdSkate, check out adskate.com. There's case studies, more detail. There's a weekly newsletter, as Akaash mentioned, called Click Factor, which goes out every Friday. So thanks for listening.